Welcome to episode 3 of the Brain and Mind examination. In this podcast series, where we're trying to understand the roots and the basis of fear and anxiety and see if we can overcome them. So, in the previous episode, we hinted at the possibility that mind, the way we know it, is probably emergent from a complex brain quantum process situation, and that almost everything in the organism is automated. Now, the purpose of this particular episode, if I had to state, is one, and that is fear is not a weakness. Feeling anxious is somehow not a problem. The moment we accept that fear and anxiety is natural, we would have taken a major step in dissolving and extinguishing it. The reason I say this is because just like a lot of the physiological systems in our body-mind apparatus is automated, so are the mental processes and especially the mental narratives which create these emotions, of fear and anger and so on and so forth. And let me try and explain this a little bit. But for that, let's try to understand how we perceive. Right? So when we see something, when we hear something, we are perceiving, right? The act of perception. So every moment we think, we feel, or we navigate the world around us, our perception of these things is built from basically 3 ingredients, right? What are these 3 ingredients? 1, we receive signals from the outside world. As I said, it could be light waves, photons entering our retinas. It could be pressure changes that reaches our skin or our tympanum. It could be molecules or various chemicals that arrive at the receptors of our nostrils or our taste buds in our tongue, that transform into aroma, sweetness, spice, etc. These are all the signals that the brain has to monitor, and these are signals from the outside. But mind you, there's also another ingredient of our experience which is completely outside our awareness, and that is the sensory data from the events that are happening inside of our body. The blood that is rushing through our veins and arteries, the incessant beating, the rhythmic beating of our heart, the lungs expanding and contracting, our stomach gurgling, our kidneys filtering, our liver and spleen and pancreas and all the other things doing its work, mostly in symphony. And all of this data is silent, is outside our awareness, and thank goodness for it. Imagine if, we felt every gurgle and every rumble. We would never be able to pay attention to anything that's outside of our skin. But that's also data that the brain has to monitor, as it monitors all the data that comes from the outside. And then there's a third ingredient, which is the ingredient of making sense of this data, both from outside and from inside. Else all of this would just be garbage. So the brain uses, experience in the form of memory to predict that what it is receiving is normal, is abnormal, needs corrections, etc. And all of this is happening invisibly, faster than we can blink. And maybe all these 3 ingredients, these are the only 3 ingredients that I'm saying, but maybe there are more, right? And I think that when the brain is doing all of this, monitoring the internal stuff, the external stuff, making sense of all of this, it is doing all of this with just one purpose: to protect, safeguard, and preserve the organism, whatever that organism is, the human body, my pet dog, whatever. Each brain is doing its thing. So the point I'm trying to make is, we tend to use this phrase, hey man, use your brain, as if I have to use my brain to think. Maybe, but that is not why the brain evolved in the first place. I don't think our brain has evolved to think. Our brain has evolved to regulate, to process all these signals and keep us alive, and alert us in the form of increased temperature or sweating or preparing the body to flee by sending glucose to the limbs, dilating the pupils, signals that come from the amygdala, which automatically triggers a lot of things within the body-mind apparatus to keep the body-mind apparatus safe. So the brain has evolved to control, regulate, and preserve the body. And many animals, such as ourselves, has evolved larger bodies with more complex internal systems that need more complex coordination and control. So this brain is a sort of command center that integrates, coordinates all of these systems, and then it shuttles the resources like water or salt or glucose or oxygen where they are needed. And I think in biology, this regulation is called allostasis, right? So it's basically the brain anticipating what the body needs even before it needs it, and then attempt to ensure that it is delivered where it is required. And if the brain does its job well through this process of allostasis, then our body system gets what it needs most of the time. And in order to accomplish this kind of balancing act, to retain a sense of continuity for the organism, the brain maintains some kind of a software model of our bodies in the world. And this includes conscious things like what we see and what we hear and feel, the actions we perform without thought, like driving a car or walking, the unconscious stuff that's happening inside our body, which is beyond our awareness. It models our body temperature. It governs our awareness of whether we are feeling cold or warm. Automatic acts like wandering into the shade. And it also, keeps monitoring changing of blood flow, opening up of our pores, to perspire. Just imagine the kinds of things that the brain has to do. And in this process of doing what the brain does is the emergence of a mind. And some parts of that mind misfire, creates chatter, creates a narrative, which may be unintended, and which is what I was trying to say in the previous episode. So the first point is, once we understand that a lot of this is automated, and we are living inside, whoever we are, inside this kind of an automated, matrix or some simulation, or whatever this is, then accepting this is the first step in overcoming. Because when we are told that fear is weakness, or if somebody feels anxious and we say, hey, show some strong, don't be so weak and things like this, I don't think we are helping the cause. Or as I said, giving people hope, which may sound beautiful, but I think it's not really helping. And the other part that I want to introduce now is, as we have evolved, from reptiles to mammals and now humans or whatever, We have inside our brain system three kinds of brains, right? We have the reptilian brain. I guess that's the brainstem, the amygdala, the limbic system. We have the middle brain, and then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is probably the most highly evolved in humans. And it is the amygdala which is responsible, the reptilian brain or the first brain, right? This is responsible for initiating the body's fear response, right? Often reacting to threats, even before the prefrontal cortex processes the information. So it is possible that, let us say, if there is a threat, and for some people, the amygdala is so overactive that even before the cortex gets into action and says, listen, guy, or listen, dude, this is not a big problem, relax, the amygdala has already triggered the autonomic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system, and we're already sweating and perspiring and huffing and puffing and shallow breaths and raised blood pressure and all of this, right? Because the amygdala has already started triggering cortisol and other things into the body system, getting us ready to fight or flight, right? When the threat is really not proportionate. So one way to deal with this kind of anxiety, where we automatically feel anxious and automatically feel panicked, is to become more deliberate. By which I mean, get our prefrontal cortex into the picture. And I'll talk about the system 1 and system 2, seminal work by Professor Daniel Kahneman from his book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow in the upcoming episodes. But for now, all I'm trying to say is, if we can consciously put our attention on the prefrontal cortex, yes, it is slow, yes, it occupies a lot of glucose, yes, it is inefficient, but it will not do the kinds of things that the amygdala does to us. So what I'm trying to say is, if we are the type of person where we are prone to react very quickly, it means that the amygdala, the limbic system based anxiety is dominant, and we must somehow bring the prefrontal cortex into action and make it stronger. This is one way. Because there's no real danger, but we're behaving as if there is an existential problem. And one way experts suggest to rewire the amygdala-based anxiety is exposure therapy. So you start writing down all the things that create the sense of anxiety or fear in you. Maybe a conversation with a lousy boss, maybe, a social engagement or something, and actually start exposing yourself to these kinds of anxiety-inducing stimuli in a very controlled and limited fashion. And then slowly, using the prefrontal cortex to rewire the amygdala and build a memory that, hey guys, listen, it's not so bad after all. Thereby, slowly making progress towards overcoming anxiety. Now, some of us are also overthinkers. We overimagine problems. I'm definitely one of those kinds. I would imagine problems and create backup solutions like it was endless, right? And this is a part of a condition where I think cognitively we generate anxiety by a pattern of thinking, excessive worrying, negatively interpreting events and stuff like this. Right? And there I think techniques like positive distraction, mindful breathing, reframing the negative thoughts, challenging these cognitive patterns. So when you have that condition where you're trying to interpret something, challenge it, because it's kind of happening autonomously. It's happening on its own because of conditioning, because of learning, because of the past conditioning. You challenge it, right? And maybe this way we can reconstruct and restructure even cognitive cortex, prefrontal cortex based worrying patterns or anxiety elevating patterns by reframing those negative thoughts. Meditation is a great way, as is introspection and reflection. And I think we can use a combination of both of this. So, the exposure theory, you make a list of all the things that bother you, create stress in you, and try to imagine a situation or create, I don't know how, but create those kind of stimuli in a controlled atmosphere, in a controlled condition, and see and train yourself to respond to it. And also, look at mindfulness. So anyway, I will stop here, and we will get into, in the next episode, a little bit about the difference between the mind and consciousness. There's a lot of talk about, whether, I've been talking about the mind as being emergent, but there is also this field where people are talking about the hard and easy problem of consciousness, and there is this theory of panpsychism, that everything is really conscious. And of course, there are scriptures, especially Hindu scriptures, which talk about the idea that there is this fundamental principle called the Brahman and stuff like this. So we will look at that in the next one. So I'll leave you with this thought that fear is not weakness. It is part of who we are. But by understanding why we have this narrative, I think we can start to extinguish it. I wish you well, and I'll see you on the other side.